In 2011, a man walked into a New Hampshire courthouse, doused himself in an accelerant, and he literally set himself on fire.
Yeah. It's a heavy way to start, but it's crucial.
Right, and the mainstream media, for the most part, just completely ignored it. Or if they did cover it, they, dismissed him as deranged. Just some tragic anomaly.
Which is exactly what the author of the text we're looking at today says is the real tragedy. We missed the point.
Exactly. He argues that this man's horrifying public death wasn't an anomaly at all. It was the mathematical, inevitable result of a system built specifically to erase him.
Right.
So if you've ever felt like the modern world is, I don't know, actively hostile to traditional masculinity, or if you've been searching for a real tactical manual to understand the collapse of the nuclear family, this deep dive is for you.
Yeah.
We are plunging into a highly provocative, unapologetically radical new ebook designed specifically for men trying to navigate the modern landscape.
It's a profoundly intense read. I mean, the author has built what he actually calls a philosophical siege engine.
A siege engine. I love that description.
Yeah, it's designed to just completely dismantle the narratives surrounding modern gender dynamics, family law, and, well, cultural history as a whole.
And before we get into the gears of that siege engine, I need to remind you to hit that like and subscribe button right now. It really helps us keep bringing you these deep dives. Today we're doing a comprehensive review of this explosive new ebook. It's called Fatherless Wound: How the Death of the Patriarch Breeds the Modern Pathology by Conrad Riker.
It really is a masterclass in the hidden history of our institutions, before they were fundamentally altered.
Absolutely. And I urge you to check out Amazon Kindle and Google Playbooks right now to grab a copy of this must-read manual. And go follow the author at Conrad Riker on Substack.
So the premise he operates from here is it's sweeping. Riker asserts that the societal chaos we're witnessing today, and we're talking about everything from the epidemic of personality disorders in young adults to the broader economic housing crisis, it is not an accident.
It's not just some byproduct of natural social evolution.
Right, it's not an accident at all.
Now, a crucial note before we dive into the meat of this, because we really need to set the stage and the mission for today. This text contains highly politically charged content.
Very much so.
Our goal today is to impartially report on the author's arguments. We aren't taking sides or endorsing the political viewpoints of the left or the right. We are simply trying to convey the intense, complex ideas contained in the original source material.
Yeah, we're here to understand the architecture of his argument.
Right.
And that architecture rests on a really specific foundation. It's the idea that a civilization that systematically murders its patriarch is mathematically doomed to pathology. Riker argues that the protective, authoritative father has been explicitly targeted for elimination.
And as a result, society is suffering from what he calls a collective derangement, like a societal schizophrenia, purely because of that removal.
Exactly.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because Riker argues that to understand how our institutions were captured in the first place, we have to look away from the courtroom or the ballot box and look at the dictionary.
Yeah, the linguistic aspect.
Right, he calls it a grammatical sleight of hand. So how exactly does vocabulary hijack an institution?
Well, what's fascinating here is how he deconstructs terms that we literally hear every single day. Let's take toxic masculinity.
Okay.
He points specifically to the 2018 American Psychological Association guidelines. These guidelines basically classify traditional masculinity traits like stoicism, competitiveness, aggression as psychologically harmful.
Right, they pathologized it.
But Riker doesn't just, disagree with this. He uses formal logic to show how the concept actually destroys itself. He uses a syllogism.
Wait, hold on, a syllogism. Run that by me one more time. How exactly is he structuring this logical takedown?
Okay, so a syllogism is just a form of reasoning. You have a major premise, a minor premise, and a conclusion.
Got it.
So Riker sets up a major premise based on the left's own definitions. Traditional masculinity, specifically proactive male agency, aggression, and courage, is defined as inherently oppressive and toxic.
Okay, I'm tracking.
Then he introduces the minor premise. Dismantling this so-called systemic oppression requires proactive, aggressive, and courageous male agency. You can't dismantle a massive power structure by being passive.
Right.
Wow. Right.
So the conclusion is that the very act of dismantling toxic masculinity actually requires the exact traits it condemns.
Making it a completely self-refuting absurdity, if I'm understanding this right. You need aggressive male agency to fight the aggressive male agency.
Exactly. It self-destructs upon contact with basic logic. He argues that toxic masculinity isn't a neutral analytical term. It's a linguistic weapon.
Because if you can convince men that their inherent protective capacity is shameful, you've disarmed them without firing a single shot.
Precisely. You make them feel guilty for the exact qualities that make them useful to civilization.
Which brings us to a word that gets thrown around constantly, patriarchy. I found his breakdown of the etymology here really illuminating.
Yeah, go back to the roots.
Right, he takes it back to Latin, pater, meaning source or father, and the Greek archein, meaning to begin, to rule, or to order. So patriarchy literally means the foundational ordering principle that initiates civilization.
Right.
To use an analogy, it's like taking the architectural blueprints that successfully built a functioning, stable house for thousands of years and suddenly classifying the concrete foundation itself as a structural defect.
That's an excellent way to visualize it. Riker points out that this redefinition is the necessary psychological cover for civilizational demolition.
Wow.
I mean, if you want to tear down a building, you first have to convince the residents that the foundation is rotten. If the source of order is redefined as oppression, people will just voluntarily dismantle their own protection.
And the people enforcing this demolition within our institutions are a specific archetype. Riker labels them the bureaucratic gamma.
Yes, the bureaucratic gamma.
I have to push back here, though, because this caught my eye in the book. Saying HR directors and diversity officers are just bureaucratic gammas who can't compete on merit. I mean, it sounds like a massive, cynical generalization. How does Riker actually justify that claim empirically? Is he just throwing insults at middle management?
Well, he justifies it by looking at the incentive structures of modern institutions. Riker argues that in a hyper-bureaucratized system, the primary goal of the institution is no longer to produce a great product or discover objective truth. The goal is to protect the institution from liability.
Oh, okay.
The bureaucratic gamma, the associate vice president of inclusion, the compliance officer, they thrive in this environment because they don't have to produce anything tangible. They compete on obedience to the prevailing ideology.
So because they aren't the engineers building the bridge or the salesmen generating revenue, their currency is just social control.
Precisely. They're intimidated by aggressive, intelligent, productive men. The alphas are the patriarchs because those men deal in objective reality.
Right.
So rather than protecting the institution from actual physical or economic harm, the bureaucratic gamma protects the institution from the uncomfortable truth. Because truth is disruptive and discomfort has now been linguistically classified as violence.
Okay, redefining words in a corporate HR department or university is one thing, but how does an HR diversity officer's worldview actually get teeth? I mean, does this linguistic game actually affect a man's physical freedom? Because Riker points to the 2011 Dear Colleague letter from the Department of Education as a massive turning point.
Oh, it absolutely affects physical freedom, and the Dear Colleague letter is the prime example of this. That letter essentially mandated that colleges set up Title IX tribunals to handle sexual misconduct allegations.
Right.
But with a drastically lowered standard of evidence, a mere preponderance of evidence, which basically means 50.1% certainty.
Riker refers to these as kangaroo courts. Let's look at the mechanics he uses to justify that aggressive label. How did the legitimate exercise of a man defending himself in these tribunals get reframed as a further act of aggression?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture of language manipulation, it's about what Riker calls the fallacy of equivocation.
Okay.
The ideological left, he argues, constantly shifts the definition of violence. In classical legal tradition, going all the way back to Roman jurists, there is a clear, hard line between the capacity for violence, which is necessary to protect a family or a border,
Right, the capacitive.
and the malicious application of violence, which is criminal.
Yeah, the soldier defending the wall is not morally equivalent to the raider attacking it. They're both using force, but the intent and the moral weight are entirely different.
Exactly. But the modern ideology collapses that distinction. So, in these campus tribunals, when an accused male student attempts to vigorously defend himself, maybe by presenting text messages or witnesses that completely contradict his accuser,
Yeah.
he is often told by the disciplinary board that his aggressive defense constitutes retaliation. His self-advocacy is categorized as a continuation of his toxic aggression.
That is insane. So the shifting definition of violence means his very capacity to stand up for objective truth is treated as a threat to the safety of the community.
Yes, the bureaucratic gamma cannot handle the friction of a man demanding due process, so they label the demand for due process as an act of violence.
It's a complete inversion of reality. But this brings up a huge historical question for me. If grammar was the first battlefield, How did this ideology physically take over the system? Because he bridges the gap from this modern linguistic manipulation to a massive historical strategy that started decades ago.
Yeah, he traces the origin of this specific strategy back to the Frankfurt School, specifically the Institute for Social Research, which was founded in Germany in 1923.
1923 Germany. So we are talking Weimar Republic, post-World War I, pre-Nazi Germany. Why is this specific group of intellectuals so central to his thesis?
Because these were Marxist intellectuals who were facing a massive crisis of theory. Economic Marxism, the idea of the proletariat rising up to overthrow the bourgeoisie, it had worked in Russia, but it was failing spectacularly to spread to the industrialized West.
Right, the workers in Germany, Britain, and America weren't revolting.
Exactly. The intellectuals had to figure out why. And their deduction was that Western civilization had a built-in immune response, the robust patriarchal family.
Wow. The family itself was the obstacle to the revolution.
That's right. The father acted as a bulwark against state overreach. He provided independent resources, and more importantly, he transmitted a value system based on competence, tradition, and hierarchy.
So as long as a man's primary loyalty was to his family line, he would never give his primary loyalty to the state.
Yes. So they realized economic Marxism would fail as long as the family was intact.
Yes.
Enter Antonio Gramsci.
But wait, cultural hegemony is a pretty big academic term. What does Gramsci's theory actually look like on the ground? How do you implement it?
Well, Gramsci was an Italian communist writing from a Mussolini-era prison cell. He realized that subversives couldn't just violently overthrow a Western government. The cultural immune system was way too strong for that. They had to capture the culture first. They had to take over the schools, the churches, the media, the legal systems. Before you can execute a political revolution, you have to execute a cultural one.
So the father, as the, what is he called, the micro king of the family, had to be culturally assassinated to make way for the macro state.
Exactly.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because Riker brings in Wilhelm Reich's 1933 book, The Mass Psychology of Fascism. Reich didn't just attack the father politically, he literally pathologized him.
He did. Reich argued that the traditional patriarchal family created what he called character armor in children.
Character armor.
Yeah, by imposing discipline, delayed gratification, and moral boundaries, the father was essentially traumatizing the child. Reich claimed that this armor bred right-wing ideology and fascism.
So he basically diagnosed traditional fatherhood as a mental disease that the state needed to cure. That is a terrifying shift. You move from saying, hey, we disagree with your politics, to saying your existence as a father is a public health crisis.
It was the formal declaration of virtue as sickness. And this theoretical framework didn't just stay in dusty German books either. It was weaponized in the 1960s by radical student leaders like Rudi Dutschke in Germany.
Right, the guy who explicitly called for the long march through the institutions.
Yes, taking Gramsci's theory and applying it practically to the universities.
What did that march look like, though? How did they actually change the curriculum?
Riker points out that the goal was never to debate the classical trivium. For centuries, Western civilization sought truth through the trivium. Grammar, logic, and rhetoric.
Where you learn how to structure a thought, test it for fallacies, argue it persuasively.
Exactly. Dutschke and his contemporaries replaced that with the destructive triad of critical theory: complain, subvert, and dismantle. The university shifted from a place of seeking objective truth to a factory teaching resentment for the patriarchal structure.
And one of the most destructive acts in this march, according to the book, was severing biology from identity. He points to psychologist John Money in 1955. Let's get into this.
This is a crucial piece of Riker's argument about the weaponization of language. Sex is an immutable, binary, biological reality rooted in gamete production. You produce large gametes or small gametes. It is an objective fact of mammalian biology.
Right.
Gender, up until 1955, was strictly a grammatical term used to classify nouns in languages like French or Spanish.
Right. A table is feminine, a book is masculine. It had literally nothing to do with human biology.
Exactly.
Yeah.
John Money hijacked the word gender and applied it to human psychology, severing it from biological sex.
Wow.
By establishing the premise that gender is merely a social construct, just a performance, the state could claim that biology is not destiny.
And think about what that means for you, the listener. If biology isn't destiny, then the biological father is just an optional, disposable accessory. If fatherhood is just a social construct, you don't need a father. You just need a state-approved surrogate who can perform parenting.
Which primed the culture perfectly. Once the culture views the father as an oppressor, whose biological connection is irrelevant, the legal machinery can move in for the kill without any public outcry.
Right. Because once the culture is primed, the legal system just drops the hammer. That brings us to Section 3 of Riker's book, what he terms the Caesar Act of the home gynocentrism and the family courts.
He pinpoints a very specific historical pivot point here. The 1969 California Family Law Act.
Ironically, signed into law by Ronald Reagan, a conservative icon.
Yeah, this codified unilateral no-fault divorce.
Explain why that is such a massive shift in the foundation of the family. Because on the surface, a lot of people might say, well, if two people are miserable, shouldn't they be able to split up? What is the underlying legal mechanic that changed?
Well, before 1969, marriage was understood legally and culturally as a binding contract, a covenant. The English word comes from the Latin maritere, to bind. To break that contract, you had to prove fault, adultery, abuse, abandonment. No-fault divorce unilaterally transformed marriage into a revocable, government-subsidized arrangement. It meant that one party could dissolve the contract for any reason, or no reason at all, and still claim the assets of the other party.
Riker argues this essentially weaponized female hypergamy with the police power of the state. He's saying that the state stepped in and said, you can break the contract, take the kids, take the house, and we will send men with guns to ensure your ex-husband continues to fund your new life.
That is precisely his argument. The state essentially nationalized the institution of marriage. And the mechanics of this financial extraction, what Reich calls legalized theft, are staggering. Let's look at imputed income.
I really need you to break this down because when I read this section, I couldn't believe it was real. Let me see if I have this analogy right. So it's like the IRS taxing you based on the fact that you have a law degree, even if you're currently unemployed and working at a coffee shop. They tax your potential, not your reality.
That is an incredibly accurate analogy.
Yeah.
Yes. Imputed income is a family court mechanism where a judge calculates child support based on what they determine a man could or should be earning, not what he actually is earning.
That's wild.
So if a man is laid off from a six-figure engineering job, or if he suffers a mental breakdown and takes a lower-paying job to survive, the court can still demand payments based on his previous six-figure salary.
It's taxing a man on an imaginary number. And if he can't pay the imaginary number, he is held in contempt.
And that leads directly to the 1986 Bradley Amendment. This federal law made child support obligations an undischargeable debt.
Meaning you can't even declare bankruptcy to get out of it.
Exactly. It cannot be retroactively modified, even if the man becomes disabled, gets imprisoned, or is hospitalized. It triggers automatic wage garnishment, driver's license suspension, passport revocation, and ultimately incarceration.
Riker calls it a return to debtor's prison, reserved almost exclusively for men.
It creates a closed loop of destruction. You lose your job, so you can't pay. Because you can't pay, the state suspends your driver's license. Because you can't get to a new job because you still aren't paying. They throw you in jail.
This leads to what he terms the Jobsian fall, like the biblical Job. It's this profound moral shock. I mean, imagine being a man who has worked his entire life, paid his taxes, followed the rules. He suddenly realizes that the institutions he believed in and protected, the police, the courts, the state apparatus, are actively conspiring to strip him of his children and his assets.
It's devastating.
It's not a hurricane or a natural disaster. It's an administrative destruction designed by people in suits. And this brings us back to the visceral, tragic story of Thomas Ball that we mentioned at the start.
It is a devastating story, and Riker really forces the reader to confront it. Thomas Ball was a father in New Hampshire. He had been put through the absolute meat grinder of the family court system. He was relentlessly alienated from his children, denied access, and simultaneously crushed financially by child support demands he literally couldn't meet. He had exhausted every legal avenue. He realized the system wasn't broken. It was functioning exactly as designed, and it was designed to destroy him.
So on June 15th, 2011, he walked to the Cheshire County Courthouse, sat on the steps, poured gasoline on himself, and lit a match.
Yeah, he left behind a 15-page manifesto detailing the exact legal mechanisms that had ruined his life and the lives of countless other men.
And Riker points out that the mainstream media completely failed to engage with his argument. They dismissed him as just a mentally ill man going through a tough divorce.
But Riker argues we have to understand this as a calculated, horrific protest against a system that explicitly intended to erase his existence as a father while mining him for resources. It was a desperate attempt to force society to look at the collateral damage of the family courts.
It's haunting. And it begs a massive economic question. If the biological father is removed from the home and his wealth is extracted, who takes his place? How does the state become the surrogate husband? Because nature abhors a vacuum.
Riker points to the macro-level economic policies, particularly the Great Society initiatives pushed by Lyndon B. Johnson in the 1960s. He specifically targets the restructuring of AFTC aid to families with dependent children and Title IV VD of the Social Security Act.
Break down Title IV VD for the listener, because this seems to be the engine driving the family courts.
Title IV VD essentially provides federal matching funds to individual states based on the amount of child support they collect.
Wait, really?
Yes, the more money a state extracts from non-custodial parents, which are overwhelmingly fathers, the more federal funding that states' agencies receive.
So the state literally pays itself by extracting money from the father. There is a direct financial incentive for the state to maximize divorce and separation.
Exactly. The state creates a multi-billion-dollar financial incentive for the destruction of the nuclear family. Furthermore, in the welfare system, the infamous man-in-the-house rules meant that a mother would lose her state benefits if an able-bodied man lived under her roof.
So the government is saying to the mother, if you keep the father around, we cut off your check. If you kick him out, we will provide housing, food, and medical care.
The state became a wealthy, coercive provider that requires no accountability. It effectively made the biological working-class father economically obsolete. A woman could receive more consistent resources from the government than from her husband, heavily incentivizing her to eject him.
So we have the linguistic capture, the cultural pathologizing of the father, and the legal and economic extraction. With the father legally and culturally excised from the home, what happens to the children left behind? This brings us to Section 4, the psychological carnage. Riker calls it the wound that breeds the beast.
To explain this pathology, Riker uses a very old philosophical concept, the Thomistic concept of privatio boni, the privation of a due good.
Okay, privatio boni. A privation of a due good. Explain that like I'm 5, because it sounds like a really dense theological term.
Think of cold. Cold isn't a physical substance that enters a room. You can't measure the mass of cold. Cold is simply the absence of heat. Heat is the act of reality.
Right.
Or think of a shadow. A shadow isn't a thing, it's the absence of light. Riker argues that modern psychological pathology, the skyrocketing anxiety, depression, and aimlessness in youth, isn't a dark substance or a virus they caught. It is a hole. It's the ontological absence of structural light. The modern pathology is precisely the absence of the father.
That makes so much sense. It's the cold that sets in when the heat of a father is removed. And he contrasts the environments created by mothers versus fathers. He talks about the estrogen-dominant environment. What does a home look like when it's entirely maternal?
Riker defines maternalism as having a telos, or an ultimate goal, of immediate comfort and stasis. It is the biological, evolutionary instinct of the mother to shield the infant from all friction, to keep it warm, fed, and safe from harm. That is a beautiful and necessary thing for an infant.
But not for a teenager.
Exactly. Paternalism, on the other hand, is defined by the telos of competence through calculated risk. The father's biological and cultural duty is to introduce the child to necessary controlled danger. He throws the kid in the deep end of the pool. He lets them climb the tree. He lets them fail.
Yeah.
The father is the forge where resilience is created.
Think about your own life for a second. Think about the times you actually grew. It wasn't when you were perfectly safe. It was when you were challenged, when you faced friction. This immediately made me think of Jonathan Haidt's concept of safetyism on college campuses.
Oh, absolutely.
We see young adults who literally perceive dissenting opinions or uncomfortable ideas as physical violence. And Riker is saying this happens because their nervous systems were never calibrated to tolerate stress by a father. They completely lack the father's forge.
Without that controlled friction, a child's nervous system remains completely uncalibrated. A generation raised exclusively by mothers and then educated by a female-dominated school system naturally demands that the state act as a surrogate maternal protector. They demand safe spaces, speech codes, and trigger warnings. They eagerly trade their civil liberties for emotional security.
But Riker points out a much darker consequence. The demand for safe spaces is the reaction of the more compliant children. What happens to the uncalibrated aggression of boys? Because that primal energy doesn't just disappear. If it's repressed by a maternal-only environment, it has to go somewhere.
It turns either inward or outward. If the uncalibrated aggression turns inward, you see the staggering rise in clinical depression, extreme anxiety, self-harm, and a terrifying epidemic of male suicide. The boy essentially apologizes for his own existence and tries to erase himself.
And if it turns outward?
If it turns outward, you get purposeless mass violence. You get the school shooter. Riker emphatically states that the media dishonestly labels these horrific acts as toxic masculinity.
Yeah.
He argues that it is the exact opposite. It is the pathology of abandoned masculinity. It is the behavior of feral boys who never received the father's logos, the ordering principle, the discipline to civilize their primal nature.
A true patriarch would have channeled that aggression into protecting the community. The absent patriarch leaves a void where chaotic violence brews.
Exactly.
And how does the culture respond to this carnage? Do they admit they were wrong? No, they send in the psychiatric industrial complex. Riker calls them the cleanup crew. Instead of prosecuting the culture that caused this fatherless wound, they prescribe pills.
He uses a very striking visceral image here. He says that prescribing an SSRI to a fatherless child is like applying a tourniquet to a stab wound while aggressively refusing to prosecute the stabber.
Wow.
The therapeutic state treats the symptoms of the fatherless mind. They numb the spiritual anguish, because acknowledging the actual cause, the missing patriarch, the system that extracted him, would indict the entire ideological framework of modernity. They would have to admit that the long march through the institutions didn't create a utopia. It created a slaughterhouse.
So, we've walked through this incredibly dark, systematic diagnosis. We've gone from the dictionary to the university to the family courts to the psychiatric ward. But Riker doesn't just leave the reader in the ruins. He doesn't just say, everything is broken, give up. The final part of the book is a tactical path out. Section 5, reclaiming the throne and integrating the shadow.
He argues that the devastation of family court, this divorce rape that so many men experience, is not just a legal tragedy. If approached correctly, it is an unwitting descent into a profound masculine initiation.
He calls it the crucible of betrayal.
Yes, the naive, trusting, blue-pilled ego that believed the system was fair, that believed doing the right thing would be rewarded, that ego must die. It is a symbolic death and a descent into the underworld. Riker argues that if man can survive this crucible without succumbing to despair or bitterness, he integrates his shadow. He sees the matrix for the cold, extractive machine it is, and the true, hardened patriarch can emerge from the ashes.
And here's where he directly attacks the modern therapeutic advice given to men trying to rebuild their lives. He fiercely rejects the concept of healing your inner child, and he goes after the 1990s Iron John men's movement. So, what does this all mean for the listener? If the advice to heal your inner child is wrong, what is the alternative? Why is Riker so opposed to modern therapy?
Riker views the inner child not as something to be cherished, but as a pre-rational, pre-moral bundle of appetites.
Yeah.
A child wants what it wants, right now, with no concept of duty, sacrifice, or deferred gratification.
Yeah.
He says that the entire process of male maturation is not about going into the woods to weep and comfort this inner child. It is about executing that infant on the altar of duty.
That is a brutal way to phrase it. Executing the infant on the altar of duty.
It is brutal because reality is brutal. The inner child seeks a mother to comfort it. The mature man seeks the father to emulate. You have to subordinate the infantile emotional self to objective reason.
It's about becoming the king. He outlines the 4 pillars of mature masculinity, starting with the true definition of a king, which he ties to the Old English word leiford, or loafword.
The loafer was literally the keeper of the bread, the provider. But more than that, the king is the arbiter, the fixed point of objective truth in a chaotic world. He doesn't react emotionally to storms, he builds shelters against them.
And this ties deeply into the Roman concept of pietas. Now, when we hear piety today, we think of sitting quietly in church, but that's not what Riker means, right?
Not at all. Classical Roman pietas is the heavy, glorious burden of duty and respect owed to your ancestors, your country, and your family line. It is the understanding that you are just one link in a massive chain. Your life is not your own to hedonistically enjoy. Your life is forfeit to the future.
This brings in the concept of the eschaton. Let's define that.
The eschaton is a theological term referring to the end of the world, or the ultimate destiny of the soul. Riker argues that the demographic winter we are seeing right now, the plummeting birth rates across the West, is statistical suicide caused by men abandoning the eschaton. When men no longer believe in a future or in a higher purpose, they stop building families. To fight this demographic collapse, men must consciously resurrect the generational chain of being. They must embrace pietas.
And to fight this battle in the cultural arena, he insists on mastering formal logic. He calls it the arsenal of truth. He tells men they must use syllogisms to shut down what he calls ideological zombies.
He specifically warns against falling for the Gish Gallop.
Right, the Gish Gallop. Explain how that works in an argument.
The Gish Gallop is a rhetorical tactic where the opponent overwhelms you with a flood of disparate, highly emotional, and often inaccurate claims in rapid succession. The goal isn't to debate facts, it's to drown you in so much nonsense that you can't possibly refute it all.
Yeah.
Riker says that men naturally try to answer every point and they end up looking defensive.
So what is the tactical counter move?
You stop the spell, you refuse to engage with the flood, you isolate one single claim, and you evaluate its logical validity using a syllogism. You anchor your rhetoric in objective empirical data. You become an unbreakable wall of reason against the chaotic emotionalism of modern pathology. You force them to deal with reality.
It is an intense, unyielding worldview. It asks everything of the reader. And that brings us to a final, incredibly provocative thought that we want to leave you, the listener, to mull over on your own. It's something Riker touches on near the very end of the book regarding our modern obsession with safety and anti-aging.
Yes, Riker asserts that the modern obsession with erasing the physical markers of aging, think of tech elites spending millions on biohacking, or the ubiquitous use of Botox to retain unblemished, smooth skin, is not just vanity. It is a metaphysical disease.
A terrified rejection of mortality.
Exactly. Riker argues that the lined face and the scarred hands are the visible grammar of endurance. They are the objective physical record of a soul that has faced the chaos of the world, taken the hits, and refused to break.
So when you paralyze your face with Botox,
You neuter the physical expressions of the logos. You turn men into docile, expressionless mannequins who are physically incapable of furrowing their brows in righteous anger or showing the deep lines of stoic contemplation. It prevents men from bearing witness to the truth of their trials. You are literally erasing your history of survival to look like an infant.
will you remain a consumer in the void, artificially smoothing out your history and hiding from the friction of reality? Or will you accept the scars, the heavy burden of pietas that come with being a patriarch? It's a heavy, profound question to walk away with, and that is our deep dive for today. If this intense breakdown resonated with you, or even if it just challenged everything you thought you knew about the institutions governing your life, you need to like and subscribe to the show right now so you never miss a deep dive like this. More importantly, you need to head over to Amazon Kindle or Google Play Books right this second to buy your own copy of Fatherless Wound by Conrad Riker. As we've seen today, it is a necessary, unflinching, tactical manual for understanding the matrix we live in. Once you've read it and the scales have fallen from your eyes, make sure to leave the book a 5-star review so other men can find this crucial guidebook. And finally, go follow at Conrad Riker at Substack to join the movement, arm yourself with the logos, and step into the arena. Thanks for joining us in the deep dive. See you next time.